It is not possible to put into words just how truly complex and horrifying the web of deception that the Emperor of Mankind weaved around his own sons really is. For 10,000 years, the Imperium has worshipped him as a god, but the truth behind his actions during the Great Crusade and the creation of the primarchs is far darker than most people realize. What we're going to talk about today is going to challenge everything you thought you knew about the Master of Mankind and the lies he told to his own children. The Emperor has always been portrayed as this brilliant, all-knowing figure who could see the future and made difficult decisions for the greater good of humanity. But when you really start digging into the lore, when you start looking at what he actually did versus what he claimed he was doing, a very different picture starts to emerge. The Emperor wasn't just secretive about his plans. He was actively lying to the primarchs about fundamental truths that would have changed everything. We're going to start with the biggest lie of all, the one that arguably caused the entire Horus heresy. The Emperor told his sons that there were no gods, that religion was superstition, and that the warp was just another dimension to be conquered and understood through science. But here's the thing. The Emperor knew this wasn't true. He had made deals with the Chaos Gods. He had walked in the warp for millennia. He knew exactly what lived there and what they were capable of. When Lorgar and the Word-Bearers were worshipping the Emperor as a god, when they were spreading the imperial truth through religious devotion, the Emperor didn't just discourage this. He humiliated them. He forced the entire Word-Bearers Legion to kneel in the ashes of Monarchia, while he told them that gods didn't exist. But the Emperor knew that wasn't true. He knew the Chaos Gods were real because he had been fighting them for thousands of years. The Emperor had spent millennia battling against the influence of chaos. He had seen entire civilizations fall to their corruption. He knew that knowledge of the Chaos Gods could be dangerous, but by completely denying their existence, he left his sons vulnerable. When the primarchs finally encountered chaos, they had no defenses against it because they didn't even know what they were facing. Magnus the Red is probably the best example of how the Emperor's lies destroyed his own sons. Magnus was incredibly powerful, one of the most gifted psykers ever born, and he genuinely wanted to help his father. When he saw Horus falling to chaos, when he saw the treachery spreading through the legions, he tried to warn the Emperor. But because the Emperor had banned all psychic communication at the Council of Nicaea, because he had told the primarchs that sorcery was forbidden, Magnus had to break those rules to send his warning. The thing is, Magnus didn't know about the webway project. The Emperor never told him that he was working on humanity's greatest achievement, a way to travel through the galaxy without relying on the warp. When Magnus sent his psychic message to Terra, he shattered the psychic barriers protecting the Imperial webway and let demons pour into the Emperor's greatest work. But Magnus had no way of knowing this would happen because the Emperor had never told him what he was actually working on. If the Emperor had been honest with Magnus, if he had explained the true nature of chaos and the importance of the webway project, Magnus could have helped instead of accidentally destroying everything. Magnus was loyal. He wanted to serve humanity and his father, but the Emperor's lies turned one of his most powerful and devoted sons into a traitor. And it gets worse. The Emperor knew that Magnus would eventually be corrupted by chaos. He had seen this future through his psychic abilities, but instead of trying to prevent it, instead of being honest with Magnus about the dangers he faced, the Emperor decided to use him anyway. He needed Magnus's psychic power to fuel the Golden Throne and the Webway project, so he was willing to sacrifice his son's soul for his grand plan. The Council of Nicaea is another perfect example of the Emperor's deception. On the surface, it looked like a fair trial where both sides could present their arguments about whether psykers should be allowed in the Space Marine legions. But the Emperor had already made up his mind before the council even began. He was never going to allow unrestricted psyker use because he knew how dangerous it was. But instead of just explaining this to his sons, he created this elaborate charade to make it look like he was being fair and democratic. Mortarion spoke against allowing psykers in the legions, and his arguments seemed to win the day. But Mortarion didn't know that the Emperor himself was one of the most powerful psykers in the galaxy. He didn't know about the thousands of psykers being sacrificed daily to keep the Emperor alive. If Mortarion had known the truth about his father's nature, would he have argued so passionately against psychic power? The Emperor let his son make arguments based on incomplete information, then used those arguments to justify decisions he had already made. The same thing happened with Leman Russ and the Space Wolves. Russ argued that his legion's rune priests were different from regular psykers, that they drew their power from Fenris instead of the warp. The Emperor allowed this obvious lie to stand because it served his purposes. The Space Wolves were his executioners, and he needed them to have psychic abilities to carry out their missions. So he let Russ believe his rune priests were somehow pure while condemning other legions for using the exact same powers. But the biggest lie, the one that really shows how manipulative the Emperor could be, was about the nature of the primarchs themselves. The Emperor told everyone that the primarchs were his sons, that he had created them using his own genetic material and advanced science. He presented himself as their father and expected their loyalty and love in return. But this wasn't the whole truth. The Emperor had made a deal with the Chaos Gods to create the primarchs. He had stolen power from the warp, from the very entities he claimed didn't exist, to bring his sons into being. The primarchs weren't just products of science. They were infused with the power of chaos from the moment of their creation. Each one carried a fragment of the Chaos Gods within them, and the Emperor knew this. When the Chaos Gods scattered the infant primarchs across the galaxy, this wasn't some random act of spite. It was part of the original bargain. The Emperor had agreed to let the Chaos Gods have influence over his sons in exchange for the power to create them. He knew that half of them would eventually fall to chaos because that was the price he had paid for their creation. This means that when Horus fell, when Fulgrim was corrupted by the Lair Blade, when Angron was consumed by rage, the Emperor wasn't surprised. He had known this would happen from the beginning. He had created his sons knowing that he would eventually have to destroy half of them. Every moment of love and pride he showed them, every time he called them his sons, was tainted by the knowledge that he had already marked them for damnation. Think about what this means for the loyal primarchs. Robut Gilliman, Rogel Dorn, Leman Russ, Ferrus Manus. They all believed their father loved them and trusted them. They fought and died for the Imperium, believing they were serving a righteous cause. But their father had been lying to them from the beginning. He had created them as weapons, knowing that their brothers would fall to chaos, knowing that they would have to fight each other in a civil war that would tear the galaxy apart. The Emperor's treatment of Angron is particularly horrifying when you understand the full truth. Angron was found on Nuceria, fighting alongside gladiator slaves against their oppressors. He had the butcher's nails implanted in his brain, devices that caused him constant pain and would eventually kill him. When the Emperor found him, Angron was leading his fellow slaves in a final battle against their masters. They were going to die, but they were going to die free. The Emperor could have saved Angron's companions. He had the power to teleport entire armies, to reshape reality itself, but instead he teleported Angron away and left his friends to die. When Angron begged to go back, when he screamed and raged about abandoning the people who had been his family, the Emperor told him to get over it. He said that Angron's companions were worthless, that his duty was to the Great Crusade now. But here's the really sick part. The Emperor knew what the butcher's nails would do to Angron. He knew they would turn him into a mindless berserker, that they would eventually corrupt his entire legion. The Emperor could have removed the nails, or at least tried to help Angron deal with their effects. But he didn't, because a raging, uncontrollable Angron served his purposes. The Emperor needed monsters to fight his wars, and Angron was the perfect monster. The Emperor let Angron suffer for over a century, let him watch his legion degenerate into blood-crazed savages, knowing all the while that this was exactly what was supposed to happen. When the heresy began and Angron sided with Horus, the Emperor wasn't disappointed. He was probably relieved that his plan was working. Perturabo's story is similar, but even more tragic because of how preventable it was. Perturabo was a brilliant architect and engineer who wanted to build beautiful things, to create wonders that would inspire and uplift humanity. But the Emperor gave him the most thankless, brutal job in the entire Great Crusade. The Iron Warriors were sent to every siege, every grinding war of attrition, every battle that the other legions didn't want to fight. Perturabo's legion was slowly ground down in these endless conflicts. They never got the glory or recognition that other legions received. They were just expected to do their duty, to die in trenches and bunkers, while the more favored legions got the heroic victories. And through it all, the Emperor never once acknowledged Perturabo's sacrifice or showed him any appreciation. But the Emperor knew exactly what he was doing to Perturabo. He needed someone to fight the ugly wars, the battles that would break other legions. He chose Perturabo for this role and systematically destroyed his spirit to make him more effective at it. The Emperor took one of the most creative and brilliant primarchs and turned him into a bitter, resentful weapon of mass destruction. When Perturabo finally rebelled, when he joined Horus and turned his skills against the Imperium, he was doing exactly what the Emperor had shaped him to do. The Emperor had created his own enemy, had systematically broken one of his sons until rebellion was inevitable. The tragedy of the primarchs is that they genuinely loved their father. Even after learning about his lies, even after being betrayed and manipulated, many of them still sought his approval. Horus, in his final moments, called out for his father. Magnus begged for forgiveness, even as he was being corrupted by Siench. Fulgrim wept when he realized what he had become, but the Emperor had never really loved them back. To him, they were tools, weapons created for a specific purpose. When they served that purpose, he showed them affection. When they didn't, he discarded them without hesitation. The relationship was never equal, never genuine. It was always the love of a creator for his creations, not a father for his children. The Emperor's lies extended beyond just the primarchs to the entire structure of the Great Crusade. He told humanity that they were bringing enlightenment and progress to the galaxy, that they were reuniting lost human worlds and building a better future. But the reality was much darker. The Great Crusade was a war of extermination. Any human world that refused to join the Imperium was destroyed. Any alien species that stood in their way was wiped out. The Emperor wasn't building a diverse, enlightened civilization. He was creating a human-only empire built on the bones of everyone else. The Emperor justified this by claiming that aliens were inherently hostile to humanity, that coexistence was impossible. But this wasn't true either. There were plenty of peaceful alien species that posed no threat to humanity. The Interrex, for example, had humans and aliens living together in harmony. But the Emperor ordered their destruction anyway because they didn't fit his vision of human supremacy. Even worse, the Emperor knew that many of the alien species he was destroying had valuable knowledge and technology that could have benefited humanity. The Eldar, for instance, had survived the fall of their own empire and possessed ancient wisdom about chaos and the warp. Instead of trying to learn from them, the Emperor ordered their extermination whenever they were encountered. The Emperor's treatment of religion during the Great Crusade was another massive lie. He claimed to be promoting reason and science over superstition and faith. But the imperial truth wasn't really about rationality. It was about control. The Emperor wanted to be the only source of truth in the galaxy, the only authority that people looked to for guidance. The imperial truth was just as dogmatic and inflexible as any religion. Anyone who questioned it or suggested alternative viewpoints was silenced or eliminated. The Emperor wasn't promoting free thinking. He was replacing one form of orthodoxy with another, one that happened to serve his interests. And the biggest irony is that the emperor was himself a godlike being with vast psychic powers. Everything he claimed to stand against, superstition, worship of powerful beings, faith over reason, was exactly what his own rule represented. He was asking humanity to abandon their gods so they could worship him instead, even if he called it something else. The emperor's secrecy about the webway project shows just how little he trusted even his most loyal sons. This was supposedly the most important work of his entire existence, the project that would free humanity from dependence on the warp and allow them to travel safely across the galaxy. But he never told any of the primarchs about it, not even Malcador, his closest advisor and friend. Think about how different things might have been if the Emperor had been honest about the webway project. If Magnus had known what his father was working on, he never would have sent that psychic message that destroyed it. If the other primarchs had understood the importance of what the Emperor was doing, they might have been more patient with his absence during the later stages of the Great Crusade. But the Emperor's paranoia and need for control made him keep even this vital information secret. He would rather risk the failure of his greatest work than trust his own sons with the truth. This decision ultimately doomed the project and condemned humanity to 10,000 years of dependence on warp travel and all the dangers that entails. The Emperor's lies about the nature of chaos were perhaps the most damaging of all. By refusing to acknowledge the existence of the chaos gods, by banning any study or discussion of them, he left the Imperium completely unprepared for their influence. When chaos corruption finally appeared, nobody knew how to recognize it or fight against it. The Emperor claimed he was protecting humanity by keeping them ignorant of chaos. But ignorance isn't protection, it's vulnerability. A person who doesn't know that a disease exists can't take precautions against it, can't recognize the symptoms when they appear, and can't seek treatment when they become infected. If the Emperor had been honest about chaos from the beginning, if he had taught the primarchs and the Space Marine legions how to recognize and resist corruption, the Horus heresy might never have happened. Horus might have recognized what was happening to him on Davin and sought help. The other primarchs might have been able to resist the whispers of the chaos gods because they would have known what they were facing. Instead, the Emperor's lies created a situation where chaos could spread like a plague through the legions. The primarchs had no defenses against corruption because they didn't even know corruption was possible. They were like children playing with fire, unaware of how dangerous it was until they were already burning. The Emperor's relationship with the Mechanicum of Mars is another example of his willingness to compromise his principles when it served his purposes. The imperial truth claimed that all religion was superstition, that science and reason should replace faith and mysticism, but the Mechanicum worshipped machines and believed in a machine god. Their entire culture was built around religious reverence for technology. The Emperor could have demanded that the Mechanicum abandon their religious beliefs as a condition of joining the Imperium. He had the power to force them to comply. But he needed their manufacturing capabilities and technical knowledge, so he made an exception. He allowed them to keep their religion while forcing every other human culture to abandon theirs. This created a massive contradiction at the heart of the Imperium. If religion was really as dangerous and backwards as the Emperor claimed, why was he allowing the Mechanicum to practice it? If faith-based thinking was incompatible with progress and enlightenment, why were the most technologically advanced humans in the galaxy deeply religious? The truth is that the Emperor's objection to religion wasn't philosophical, it was practical. He didn't want people worshipping other gods because he wanted them to worship him. The Mechanicum's religion was acceptable because it didn't compete with his own authority. Their machine god was distant and abstract, while the Emperor was present and active in their lives. The Emperor's treatment of the Space Marine legions reveals another layer of his deception. He presented the legions as humanity's protectors, the finest warriors created to defend mankind from the dangers of the galaxy. But the legions were never really meant to protect humanity, they were meant to conquer it. Each legion was designed for a specific type of warfare, optimized for different kinds of conflicts. The World Eaters were perfect for breaking enemy morale through sheer brutality. The Night Lords were ideal for terrorizing populations into submission. The Iron Warriors specialized in grinding sieges that would wear down any resistance. These weren't the tools of protectors, they were the instruments of conquerors. The Emperor knew that the Great Crusade would require horrific violence, that bringing the galaxy under human rule would mean exterminating countless species and destroying entire civilizations. He created the legions to be capable of this level of destruction, but he dressed it up in noble language about duty and service to humanity. The Space Marines themselves were victims of this deception. They believed they were heroes, that their actions were justified by the greater good they were serving. They didn't understand that they were being used as instruments of genocide, that their noble ideals were being exploited to make them complicit in atrocities. When some of the legions began to question their role, when they started to see the contradiction between their supposed noble purpose and their actual actions, they became vulnerable to chaos corruption. The word-bearers turned to religion because they needed something to believe in beyond mere conquest. The Emperor's children pursued perfection because they needed to feel that their violence served a higher purpose. The Emperor's grand plan for humanity was built on a foundation of lies, and those lies ultimately destroyed everything he was trying to create. The Horus heresy wasn't a betrayal of the Emperor's vision. It was the inevitable result of the contradictions and deceptions he had built into the system. By lying to the primarchs about the nature of chaos, he made them vulnerable to corruption. By treating them as tools rather than sons, he created resentment and rebellion. By building an empire on conquest and genocide while claiming to serve noble ideals, he created a system that could only be sustained through ever-increasing violence. The Emperor probably believed that his lies were necessary, that the truth was too dangerous or too complex for others to handle. But his deception created far more problems than it solved. The primarchs might have been able to handle the truth about chaos if they had been prepared for it. They might have been able to resist corruption if they had understood what they were facing. Instead, the Emperor's paranoia and need for control doomed his own project. The Imperium he created was a hollow shell, built on foundations of sand. When the truth finally came out, when the lies could no longer be maintained, everything collapsed into civil war and chaos. The tragedy is that it didn't have to be this way. The Emperor had the knowledge and power to create something genuinely great. A civilization that could have stood against the darkness of the galaxy. But his inability to trust others, his willingness to sacrifice anything and anyone for his goals, turned his greatest triumph into his ultimate failure. The Imperium of the 41st Millennium is the Emperor's legacy, a rotting corpse of an empire held together by ignorance, fanaticism, and brutality. It's exactly the kind of civilization the Emperor claimed to be fighting against during the Great Crusade. The irony is that by lying to prevent this outcome, he guaranteed that it would happen. Today, 10,000 years later, the truth about the Emperor's lies is still hidden from most of humanity. The Imperium worships him as a god, exactly what he claimed to oppose. They practice the kind of blind faith and dogmatic thinking he said was holding humanity back. They commit atrocities in his name while believing they're serving a righteous cause. The primarchs who remain loyal still struggle with the weight of their father's deception. Robert Guilliman, now awake and serving as the imperial regent, has seen firsthand what the Imperium has become. He knows that everything his father worked for has been perverted and corrupted. But he also knows that the truth about the Emperor's lies would destroy what little stability the Imperium still has. So the cycle continues. The lies that destroyed the Great Crusade are still being told, still shaping the destiny of humanity. The Emperor's deception has become the foundation of human civilization, and admitting the truth would bring it all crashing down. The full story of the Emperor's lies is a warning about the dangers of absolute power and the corruption that comes from believing that ends justify means. The Emperor thought he could control the truth, that he could manipulate reality itself to achieve his goals. But truth has a way of asserting itself, and lies have a way of destroying everything they touch. In the grim darkness of the far future, humanity pays the price for their God's deception every single day. They live in ignorance and fear, fighting wars they don't understand against enemies they can't comprehend, all because their father decided that the truth was too dangerous for them to know. The Emperor of mankind may have been the most powerful human who ever lived, but he was also the greatest liar in human history. And in the end, those lies didn't save humanity. They doomed it to an eternity of suffering in a galaxy that no longer makes sense. This is the truth that the Imperium cannot face, the reality that would shatter their faith and destroy their world. The God Emperor of mankind was never a god at all. He was just a man who lied so well and for so long that even he started to believe his own deception.